America's elder statesman, George Shultz, on foreign affairs, of course. But before Shultz was Secretary of State, he was Secretary of Treasury and Secretary of Labor and Director of the Budget. He's going to tell us what's wrong with the economy and what he thinks the Obama administration needs to do to fix it. Let's get started. U.S. unemployment is at 10%, the budget deficit is at 10%, and growth is under 2%. What's to be done? I wanted to ask George Shultz. Most remember him as the Secretary of State who helped end the Cold War, but he's also a great economic mind. He has a PhD in economics from MIT, was Dean of the Chicago Business School, ran the country's biggest engineering firm, and of course held 3 other cabinet positions, all related to the economy: Budget Director, Secretary of Labor, and Secretary of the Treasury, as I mentioned. He is now a distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He's just published Ideas and Action, which includes his 10 commandments for negotiations. Shultz was an early supporter of George W. Bush and has been critical of President Obama's economic policies. So let's listen to him and find out what his solutions are. George Shultz joined me from Stanford University. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Secretary.
My pleasure, Fareed.
Let's start with the short-term economic crisis, because you've written some things about the longer-term issues, and I want to get to them as well. But right now, you have a situation where unemployment remains stubbornly high. The consumer is still not spending, perhaps shell-shocked from the bursting of the credit bubble. Businesses are still not spending. They still have a lot of capacity and don't see the need to add capacity. In that circumstance, many people say, look, the government is the only player who has the capacity to do something. What do you say to those who believe that if the government doesn't spend, and in fact, if it starts cutting, you are going to put an already fragile economy in a downward spiral?
I think what we have had in effect is an anti-growth policy. The name of the game is economic growth. And we've had a set of policies that maximize uncertainty, that threaten to reduce incentives, where you have little quick fixes that aren't permanent. And all the evidence shows that if you have something that's temporary, it doesn't really change behavior very much. And also a sense that the playing field can change. No real commitment to to rules as distinct from administrative actions. Tell us what the playing field looks like. And we know the rules, and we're confident that you're not going to change them in the middle of the game, then we'll play the game. But if you keep saying to us, we don't know what the rules are, and to the extent that there are some, we're going to change them in the middle of the game, I say, well, I don't want to play that game. So that's why I say we've got to create some certainty, and we've got to get back to paying attention to incentives, and we've got to get back to having people have skin in the game. So all these things add up to an anti-growth policy. And what we should do is change it to a growth policy. That's what we need to do.
So let's talk about that. What would a pro-growth agenda that George Shultz would write look like? What are the 4 or 5 key elements that are going to get businesses to start spending again?
Number 1, I would enact a very short bill that says the income and inheritance tax rates that are in effect in 2009 will remain in effect until Congress changes them, period. Very short, 1-sentence bill. Be so refreshing instead of these thousands of pages of bills. So that would create some sense of where the tax rates are going to be. Then I would rein in this excessive government spending. It's just totally out of control. And I would tackle the entitlement programs. Let me come first to Social Security. Somehow people are afraid to touch it because they're afraid of reactions from older people. I've examined this issue with some care. I have yet to see any proposal that changes anything as far as older people are concerned. This is not about older people. It's about younger people and preserving the system for them. Then you've got to look at the healthcare system. Its costs are rising. Everybody understands that, sees that. The recent healthcare bill, if anything, makes that cost problem worse. And so we've got to start doing things that get the costs under control, and we know how to do it.
How? What would you do?
The same way you do it the way we do it in every other industry. Why is it that in computers, the quality goes up and the price goes down all the time? Moore's law. Why is it that in other industries the same thing happens? It's because you have an empowered consumer. When you have an empowered consumer, when the consumer has resources, and there's a reasonably competitive market and reasonable information, costs come down and quality goes up. We've got to get back to the consumer in the game.
But, Mr. Secretary, even if you got all the things you're describing, David Stockman, who was the budget director for Ronald Reagan, says you need to do all the things you described. But he says still, if you look at the budget deficits and you look at the projected budget deficits, particularly once the baby boomers really start retiring, you're going to have to raise revenue. There is simply no way. The math doesn't work without raising revenue. And your proposal number one effectively locks in the Bush tax cuts, which means that you lose about $700 to $800 billion of revenue over the next 10 years. How would you make the math add up?
Well, I don't agree with your math. That is, I think the way to produce revenue right now is to create some certainty about tax rates and leave the incentives there and have the economy expand. An expanding economy is the best way there is to generate revenue. So that's the way to start. Then I think you need to look at the tax system. And everybody agrees it badly needs reform. The corporate tax rate is punitive, too high. There are all kinds of gimmicks in the tax code that need to be taken out. And lots of other things can be done. There are many proposals for it. And so a serious effort needs to be made to do a kind of revision, sort of like we did in 1986 in the Reagan administration. Incidentally, that massive tax reform was passed on a bipartisan basis. Lots of Democrats as well as Republicans voted for it.
Well, let's talk about that, because any kind of massive overhaul of any of these systems, Social Security, health care, particularly the tax structure, which of course is 16,000 pages, which is mostly 16,000 pages of giveaways to various special interests, is going to have to be done on a bipartisan basis. You give up your special interests in return for mine. It seems as though anyone who tries to come forward with a compromise is immediately attacked by each flank of his or her party. How do you change that?
I don't know. I've been away from Washington for 20 years now, and what I read is not comforting, but I remember when we came into office in the Reagan administration, we had a terrible situation on our hands, inflation in the double digits and the Soviet Union running wild and so on and so on. And Jimmy Carter had called the situation malaise, and people were talked about how it was ungovernable. It didn't turn out that way. And we can change things around, and I think people can be appealed to. People are saying, what's the message of the election? And I'm sure there are lots of messages, but I think one of the messages must be, Washington isn't working, and for goodness sakes, will you guys please get together and try to accomplish something sensible? So maybe that message can be brought to bear and something sensible can come out here.
But again, let me ask you, in your Wall Street Journal op-ed, I think you mentioned that there was a period of spending restraint in American government, which was roughly speaking the mid-1980s through 2001. And you attribute it to stronger growth, which is absolutely true. But the deficits came down after having doubled initially under Reagan, because George Bush Sr. and then Bill Clinton also raised taxes. And what I'm wondering is, if you take taxes off the table, will you ever be able to get the deficits down?
I don't say take taxes off the table forever. I said, first, have a tax regime that people know is there for a while, and have it be one that creates incentives and get the economy moving. In the cases that you mentioned, the economy was moving. And so these were changes that had to do with an expanding economy, a healthy economy. So the first task is to get economic growth going. And you don't do that by raising taxes.